is it right to say that Hawkins was one of the first slavers to actually trade people?
I believe he was absolutely the first Englishman to trade Africans across the Atlantic. Yeah, the Portuguese and the Spanish had already been doing it for 50 years or whatever, but they had the whole thing locked down. It's probably worth talking about that just for a minute, actually, because that kind of puts into context what Hawkins and then Drake later did or had to do. Because after the discovery of the New World, so we had New Spain and the West Indies and the colonies and the Spanish Main, all that kind of stuff. So Spain had colonized the Central and South American coasts for about the previous 50 years. And they had ports everywhere along the Spanish Main, Caribbean islands, Mexico, obviously, and most of the serious wealth from those colonies came from silver and gold mines in South America and Central America. And the bullion was exported in kind of a regular, heavily armed convoy called the flotilla. But then there were obviously farms and plantations and all kinds of economic activity, and loads of people were getting rich there. And there's all these small towns and ports that are kind of pretty isolated and relatively vulnerable to attack because there wasn't standing armies or anything. There was, for their defence, they had militia, just the townsmen organised with arquebuses and pikes and stuff, and they might have small forts and low walls and obviously cannons, batteries and stuff. A lot of them had, because they had manpower shortages, they actually organised their black slaves or even local Indians into militia forces, and those were kind of notoriously unreliable. They obviously weren't loyal to the Spanish at all, so as soon as any kind of action started, they just quite often they ran off. And it's important to note that the Spanish had closed all of the New World to outsiders. So only the Spanish were allowed to trade. The Spanish and the Portuguese were allowed to trade in the New World, and other countries.
So this is something. So this is something where I think this one bit I know. I think it was in the 1490s that one of the popes, one of the Borgia popes, Alexander VI, I think. Is that when he cut the New World up along one of the parallels?
Yeah, east and west. Yeah, so there's a line that he drew down. So because it was basically everything to the east of the line is Portuguese.
Right, yeah, okay.
Is Spanish, and he kind of happened to draw it down. He kind of thought it was drawing down through the middle of the Atlantic, not realizing that Brazil basically was entirely on the other side, that kind of bulbous bit of northeast South American continent. Yeah, so it was basically because what the idea was so that the Portuguese would then have all of India and all of the Spice Islands, and then that Spain would have all of the New World. But basically what happened was, and Africa as well. So the idea was that Portugal would have Africa, India, and the Far East. But in practical terms, it was the Spanish and the Portuguese were the only ones that were allowed to trade in the New World. So
right.
Other countries in Europe were like, well, how is that possibly fair? Like, because you don't have to, like, other countries can trade in Spain. It's not like the Spanish coast is open to other people to come and trade in. And, if you can go and trade in France and the Spanish can come and trade in England, like, why should, fair enough, it's your territory. We understand that. You're protecting it. You're controlling it. It is Spanish territory, but we need to be allowed to trade in it. And the Spanish would always just say no. But then there were Portuguese and French ships doing illegal trading. So because each of these ports and little towns in the New World had a governor or a treasurer or someone in charge, and they were to some extent, not by law but in practical terms, a law unto themselves to some extent, because it's very likely there might be hundreds of miles between one town to the next. Like the size of the area is compared to Europe is massive. Like the Spanish Main, talking about Spanish Main from Venezuela to going around to Colombia, and then up all the way to the top of Mexico. That's like about 4,000 miles. And then there's Florida on top of that. And all the West Indies, Cuba and Hispaniola islands are massive just in themselves. And then on top of that, you've also got the Pacific coast of South America, like all of Chile and Peru. But nobody went round to that bit. That was only the Spanish went there. Not very many of them. Most of it was located in the West Indies. But then so basically some French and some Portuguese would come in illegally to a local town, and the local governor might trade illegally. But the Spanish authorities, whether it's the Viceroy of Mexico or the ones back in Spain, would try to clamp down on it and punish the Spanish governors that were trading illegally. But there was so much, it was obvious to all of Europe, there was so much wealth in the New World. Like everyone wanted a piece of it. And it was just about working out how to get in on the action. basically.
And
And
if
John, sorry, go on.
and if the Spanish found any other ships other than Spanish ships in their waters, they just regarded them as just like enemies, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, basically. So there was various tactics that the illegal traders would use, and Hawkins used stuff like this as well. We would say, we've been blown off course. We were just off the coast of Africa, just minding our own business, and a storm blew up and blew us right across, and now we're desperate we need water and food, and can we come and we come and trade with you to get just some water and food? That's all we want. And then they would trial various means to get around it. So like they would, on one of the voyages, Hawkins basically kind of landed men on the coast and like fired on a town, and it seems like it was quite theatrical, and that a lot of the town governors were in on it, but they had to make a show of being forced into trading. So what probably actually happened in a lot of these cases was John Hawkins would sail up with his 5 ships full of slaves, and the local governor would say, I can't trade with you. And Hawkins would say, that's fine. We're just here for some water, and then we'll be off again. But while we're here, maybe we could come to some sort of arrangement, and they'd do like a bit of small trading or whatever. And if that didn't work, Hawkins would fire on the town, maybe like fire some cannons and blast a couple of houses down or whatever. And then the local governor would say, okay, I'll buy your slaves off you. Don't wreck my town. And then they'd shake hands and off they'd go. And then the governor would write to the viceroy of Mexico or the viceroy of Peru and say, I was forced into it. I didn't have any choice. They had way more men and way more guns than me, and I had to do it. But then, and that worked for a while. But then on the 3rd voyage that Hawkins went on, and Drake was on all 3 of them. On the 3rd one, in between the 2nd and the 3rd one, the authorities had removed the governor of one of the towns. The town that did the most business with him on the 2nd voyage. So the new governor, he was there on the 3rd voyage, said, no way. So the Spanish authorities got wise to all the tricks that they were playing, and they made an example of one of the ones that on the 2nd voyage of John Hawkins, he'd bought, I don't know how many, say 300 slaves off of John Hawkins, and Hawkins had come back rich and gone, yes, he's brilliant. And then when he tried to do it again a couple of years later, took the slaves across to this town, there was a new governor there, and the new governor said the last guy, who was a minor noble, actually of the nobility, was taken back to Spain under arrest, convicted of illegal trading, and stripped of his titles of nobility and all of his lands, which is a terrible punishment, obviously, for a noble. So the next guy that was there was like, no way, like I'm not doing anything. Like you can threaten me. I'm not taking bribes. You haven't got a bribe big enough to pay me, because if I trade with you for any reason, I'm going to end up a commoner without a penny to my name. So that was obviously a massive blow to Hawkins, because he had no other way. He had about 6 ships on this one. Maybe we should talk a bit about the makeup of the fleets and how they worked. So what would happen is John Hawkins would sail down to Africa, off the coast of Africa, and he would get slaves by various methods. One of the things that they did was buy them from local traders. Another thing they did was to attack and subdue Portuguese slaving vessels and just take them. So just open piracy, just actual piracy, high seas piracy, just chase down Portuguese slave ships and then just take the slaves off them and everything else they had. Or what they also did, and Drake was a party to this, on at least, I know this happened on the 3rd one, I don't know if it happened earlier, but I know on the 3rd one, they, on a couple of occasions, landed on the African coast, landed 100 or 200 Englishmen and charged into a village and snatched the men and took them back to their ships, which is staggering. They didn't just buy them off of African slave traders. They actually did land and attack them. And it's weird, there's all these references, like trying to imagine what this would have actually been like in 1570, whenever it was, 1560s, what the African coast was like. But what actually happened on the 3rd voyage to Africa, they got involved in like local tribal warfare politics stuff, where there was an invasion happening from one tribal people against another, and this one tribal people had crossed a river and built like a village or a stockade, basically, to use as a base to gradually conquer this other people. There's other people that were being attacked. They made contact with Hawkins somehow and came to some agreement to say, if you help us defeat our invaders, you can have all of the captured prisoners. You can just have them as slaves. That's your payment for helping us protect ourselves. So whether they actually thought they were doing a good thing protecting these people, or they didn't care, or it was just a way to get slaves, I don't know. But they got involved in this local intertribal warfare, and there's a few references to it. There's quite a lot of original first-hand accounts of these voyages from people that were writing about it, because Drake became famous in his own time, so, and Hawkins was as well. So there were a lot of people that were on these voyages either soon after or later in life, wrote about them because people were interested, because it was really amazing stuff. So we know that what happened with this particular slaving raid was they helped this tribe to go and defeat this supposedly attacking tribe, and they used their guns, I think, on two of the smaller ships to sail upriver, and they blasted a hole through. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, so the English would have had, like, breastplates and metal helmets and against nothing. Yeah. So they had, the even the little ships, the really little ships, they were still big enough to cross the Atlantic, but they weren't massively heavily armed. They might have had about 30 people on them, or maybe 40 people, and a couple of cannons. But still, a cannon is better than having no cannon, even if it's a small one. So the English sailed upriver, coordinated with an attack by land from this other tribe, and the English blasted a hole in the stockade around this other African village, and then their allied tribe just kind of charged across the river, charged into this stockade, and just started slaughtering everyone. And the English were ready to kind of charge in and help subdue this other tribe, but they just basically stood back and watched as this African tribe just cut this other one to pieces, and they were just slaughtering them left and right, and they were apparently eating their flesh, like cutting them down and then just like starting to chew up their flesh right there on the battlefield. And then they were kind of agreed there was like 600 prisoners or something, and they said, yeah, these are our prisoners. But then their allied tribe killed loads of them. But anyway, they took a few hundred prisoners from this raid, and then a few other purchases and a bit of other piracy. They ended up with hundreds of African slaves in their ships, and these ships were obviously these voyages of Hawkins weren't like officially sanctioned by the state, but then at the same time they were unofficially sanctioned by the crown. Well, it was all very secret, wasn't it? Wasn't it all very sort of cloak and daggers, and the conversations that the really senior people in the court had with captains such as Hawkins and Drake were, a matter of massive secrecy.
Yeah, to a certain extent, because it was, on the one hand, the Queen and her chief counsellors, like Cecil, were speaking to Spain and saying, we want peace, we don't want to get into any conflict with you, we want to maintain good relations and all that kind of stuff. And on the other hand, after Hawkins' first voyage made money, the second one and the third one attracted investors like Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was one of the financial backers, and the Earl of Pembroke, and also like the chief Royal Navy authorities, like the Lord Admiral, and even Queen Elizabeth herself was an investor in these second and third slaving voyages. So even Elizabeth was one of the investors. So she put in cash expecting a return, but she also provided her own warships. So the Royal Navy warships were kind of given or rented. That was part of the investment on the voyage. So she provided, on the second and third, she provided this massive old ship called the Jesus of Lubeck, or just called the Jesus, but it was from Lubeck originally, or it was owned by Lubeck at some point. It was really old. I think it was one of Henry VIII's ships, the Jesus of Lubeck. And on the third voyage, she also contributed another royal warship called the Minion, which was much smaller. But the Jesus of Lubeck was it had like a 800-ton capacity. It was massive, but it was kind of past it. It was leaky and old, really, but still it was massive, so they could fit loads of slaves on it. So yeah, it was not official, but it totally was as well at the same time. It's this weird period of where there was like a private venture which the crown was also invested in because they wanted the cash, and they were concerned about how Spain might take it all, because there was the proper rules about trade. Like, you couldn't, even if you were Spanish, you couldn't just rock up and start trading. You had to get a license to trade in the Caribbean. You had to register what goods you were trading. Like in Seville, you had to, if you're a Spaniard trader, you had to say, this is the goods I'm going to be trading. You have to pay import duties on slaves, all that. And that's if you were Spanish and Portuguese. And if you weren't Spanish or Portuguese, those processes of logging your cargo and stuff, you were barred from doing that. So then, like, the Spanish would complain to Elizabeth and say, just complain about the illegal trading. And they'll say, like, you wouldn't even pay the import duties and stuff. And the English were like, well, you're excluding us from the whole processes, so we have to do it this way. And then we're obviously not going to pay import duties and stuff. So yeah, so that was what was happening at the time. And then on the third one,
well,
The third voyage. Sorry, go on.
Would you say there's Cold War, at least commercially, a Cold War between England and Spain, and that people like Hawkins and Drake are like special forces? Obviously, a modern idea, but something like that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a case to be made to that, because a lot of them were so passionate about their religious beliefs that they saw that Spain was an enemy because it was Catholic no matter what. So anything they did that was at the detriment to Spain was good, And I think people even like Walsingham and Cecil probably felt that way personally as well. And I don't know about the Queen, but she seemed to always be trying to maintain peace and avoid war and open war and that kind of thing. But how much of that was practical and how much of it was just trying to avoid open conflict, I don't know. But certainly, like we said, that there's obviously a lot of multiple reasons for doing anything, So certainly some of it was motivated by that, for sure. But I think we know again from Drake's writing that it was because of what happened at the end of the third voyage that really turned Hawkins and Drake passionately against the Spanish. Yeah, so the event it took place at this place called San Juan de Ulúa. So what happened was, after they'd completed this third voyage, maybe we should give reasons for, maybe we should say what happened on that voyage. So because the Spanish wouldn't trade with Hawkins on this third and final voyage, he basically attacked this town. They attacked it by force. They landed, I think, 400 men and attacked the town and forced the local militia out of the town, took the town hostage basically, and then said, if you want your town back, you have to buy our slaves from us. And the governors gave in basically, and then bought they didn't, it wasn't like a open piracy where they attacked the town, stole all the stuff. They attacked it as a way to force them into a fair trade, There was other kind of little conflicts as well. Like, we think it was Francis Drake who was given command. This third voyage is when he was given his first command of one of the really small ships. It was probably had a tonnage of something like 25 tons, or maybe 32 tons. It was this little ship, really little. Like, later on, other witnesses thought that his ship was a tender, like a pinnace for one of the larger ships, not a ship in its own right. That's how small his first command was. But we think what happened is he was sent ahead in that ship with the other smallest ship to start the initial kind of negotiations with this town. But they were turned away, and then they had an exchange of gunfire where I think a couple of Drake's men were hit by a cannonball and killed. And then Drake, again, we don't know for sure it was Drake, but it's the kind of thing that he would do, so it probably was. They shot a cannonball through the governor's house, and then they pulled back, and they blockaded the port until the rest of the fleet could come up, and they took the town, forced them to buy their slaves, and then they did a bit more trading and a bit more low level, not kind of piracy type stuff in the region. And then they were sailing back, and they were going to sail the way they were going to sail back to England. And they were all pretty rich now, all they had to do was get home, and they would all be wealthy men. And they sailed up past Cuba, and they sailed between Cuba and Florida. And just as they were heading out towards the Atlantic, a huge storm blew up and blew them all the way back to Mexico, basically, near to Veracruz. And it was this place, because of this long storm that lasted a week or 2 weeks, and they were blown for hundreds of miles, they suffered quite a lot of damage. So they had to repair the ships before setting out again. So they had to find an anchorage, basically. And they came to this place called San Juan de Ulúa. It was like a long island, just a little way offshore. And in between the island and the shore was like a deep, safe anchorage. So you could get these big kind of galleon-type ships in there, where you'd have the nose against the island and the stern of the ship against the mainland. And on the island, it was like basically a sandbar, really. And the Spanish had a gun battery on it and a church, and maybe a few huts for the people that live there. And on the mainland bit, which was just a few like 100 yards or whatever across this stretch of water, was just a few huts. It was barely a town, barely anything, but it was a really good little harbour. So they came to this, and they had about 7 ships, I think. Hawkins at this point had this massive, really old warship, the Jesus of Lubeck, and they had this smaller, more modern warship called the Minion, and then a bunch of other ones of decreasing size down to Drake's little tiny one. and they all parked up there, anchored, made fast to the land, started their repairs. And then a few days later, just out of sheer bad luck, an entire Spanish fleet arrived. And it was, I think the fleet was under the command of the brand new Viceroy of New Spain. And he was just arriving from Spain to New Spain at the head of this flotilla, at the head of this fleet, basically.
There just weren't supposed to be any British ships in the waters.
No, they weren't supposed to be there. And the fact is that they've been there since they've been there. They've been bullying their way around all these little ports, and it forced them to make these trades and stuff. And so word had spread, like, there's this English fleet in our waters, and they've done this and this and this. They've basically committed all these crimes, and they would have been away, but then they had the bad luck of this storm, and then the bad luck again to run into this massive fleet that was just coming into Veracruz. So it was 2 giant warships and I think 8 huge merchant vessels that were also armed, all massive and all powerful. And they kind of totally outgunned the English, so there's a kind of a standoff really.